TriState Freethinkers podcast from October 7th, 2015, History of Slavery and Anti-Slavery, with guest speaker Caleb Benadum from the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center.
So my name is Caleb Benadum. I also work for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. I'll go ahead and assume that most of you know what it is, but just in case you don't, you can probably see it if you just walk out the doors there. It's right across the river, 50,000 square feet on the banks of the Ohio River. It celebrates the legacy of the men and women who fought for freedom on the Underground Railroad. So what I do at the Freedom Center is I'm also a program manager. I manage one of our programs. Okay, cool. I also manage one of our anti-human trafficking programs. I manage a program that we call the Tip Report Global Heroes Network. Every year, the State Department releases a report called the Tip Report, which is it stands for Trafficking in Persons Report. They've been doing it since 2004. It was actually modeled off of earlier reports that have been released every year since actually the 80s from the Bureau of Human Rights that was created during Jimmy Carter's presidency. But the TIP report has been released since 2000. It was mandated by federal legislation, and since 2004 they've been releasing an award along with that and giving an award to 7 to 10 people around the world working on issues of human trafficking. And those people are the TIP report heroes. So my program attempts to connect to those. I run a website as well as communicate directly with the heroes and attempt to foster a community as well as write and edit video and pretty much do whatever needs to be done. So there's a picture of the Freedom Center. It might be up there while we're introducing ourselves. This is a roadmap for what we're going to go through today. So I'm going to start and I'm going to talk about the history of slavery and then also the history of anti-slavery. When we get to anti-slavery, I'm going to focus on modern anti-slavery. I'm going to go through some common myths about human trafficking. I'm going to go through an overview of slavery today, and then I'm briefly going to cover human trafficking in Ohio. Most of our programs, we do primarily awareness work. Most of our programs are aimed at national and international human trafficking. We do work closely with the people that work on human trafficking here in Ohio and in the tri-state area. And I'll tell you, Mariah will tell you a little more about Cincinnati opportunities and some of the people that work with human trafficking here in Cincinnati. And also, you've already heard from several people that work with issues that are very closely related to human trafficking, namely labor exploitation and LGBT youth, which is in the United States, LGBT youth, and also around the world. Homeless LGBT youth is a population that's extremely vulnerable to all types of exploitation, but also to human trafficking. So let's start way back when with chattel slavery in the United States. I assume that most of you are familiar with these dates, but I think it's useful to go back through what this looks like. And at the Freedom Center, we connect human trafficking to slavery, because clearly our mandate is to celebrate the people who fought against historic chattel slavery in the 1800s, and then connect that to the fight against slavery and for freedom today. So import of slaves began in Jamestown in 1619. The slave trade was legal. The import of slaves was banned. Right around that time, most European countries were banning the actual transatlantic slave trade. And then you had a series of federal acts all throughout the century, including the Fugitive Slave Act, where after 1850, there was another Fugitive Slave Act as well, but after 1850, it was part of the deciding what happened to territories after the war with Mexico and the properties that we got from Mexico. So after 1850, you could reclaim a slave wherever the slave was in the continental United States, as long as it was your property. It didn't matter if the slave was in the north, still your property. So the slave could run from the very, very bottom of Louisiana all the way up to the very, very top of New York. They could run to Maine, and if a slave catcher caught them in Maine under federal law, they could return them legally to Louisiana and to their their owner. The Christiana incident actually illustrates this very well because that happened in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, a group of people fought back. Slaves escaped from Missouri. I'm going to start calling them freedom seekers because, runaway slaves, not the greatest term. Freedom seekers running away from their master owner in Missouri, ran up to Pennsylvania. The owner got a bunch of people together, came up to Pennsylvania, which was a free state, and came into their property, and there was a firefight, and the owner was killed, and every single person that was involved in the Christiana incident on the side of the freedom seekers was tried for treason under federal law. They were not convicted, but I think that illustrates clearly. So after 1850, the Underground Railroad oftentimes actually became about going to Canada, which is one of the reasons that Cincinnati and Ripley, Ohio, which is 45 minutes out east, became such big hubs, is because you could get to Lake Erie and take a ferry very easily. So, again, we have the fighting in Kansas, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, and finally, the end of chattel slavery in the United States with the passage of the 13th Amendment at the completion of the Civil War in 1865. This is the history of chattel slavery in the United States. Chattel slavery is the legal ownership of another human being, where you, under the law, are allowed to own another person. We tend to think of chattel slavery as antique and ancient, mostly because it did end in our country in 1865. This is not the case for the world. In many places, chattel slavery was not abolished until the 1960s, 1970s, and the last country in the world to abolish chattel slavery was Mauritania in 1984. So not nearly as ancient or antique as we think, and as you can imagine, Mauritania, which a high proportion of the population was in chattel slavery, a lot of that is continued on, whether or not it actually has the color of the law. So, in our country, 1865 came, 13th Amendment, chattel slavery was abolished, and then we kind of tried to forget about slavery. I mean, there were a series of equal rights decisions in the civil rights movement and so on and so on, but we stopped really using the term slavery to refer to anything that was happening now. There were a couple exceptions. One was what was called the white slave trade of the early part of the century, which more or less was forced prostitution. It's a strange name, but that's the name that it was known by at the time. And if you look up articles and books on the white slave trade, you'll find articles about forced prostitution in the beginning of the century. And there was the International Abolition Federation was actually started because of that, which is now something different. And then there was an International Convention for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic, which happened. It was a League of Nations convention, so it was prior to World War II. Then we started to have, and as we talk about human trafficking, and this will become very clear in just one second, there are really two sides to human trafficking. Human trafficking, as we talk about it, and it's in our law as well, and whatever else, it's an umbrella term, oftentimes. But we can think about it in two very broad categories, and that is sex and labor. And so as I talk about the history of where we got to where we are today in terms of the movement against human trafficking, you'll see that I'm tracing two parallel lines. One is the movement against forced prostitution, and one is the movement against labor exploitation, but labor exploitation that's severe enough that can be considered slavery. So, the movement against forced prostitution, we did have some movement in the mid part of the century with the UN Convention for the Suppression of the Trafficking of Persons and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others, but which was, I believe, in the 60s, 50s or 60s, but we didn't really, that kind of still faded out until we got to the women's movement of the 1980s and sort of culminating in the fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1994. Very famous conference. Hillary Clinton said, "Women's rights are human rights." Well, one of the one of the things that came out of the Beijing conference was a series of goals, a series of this is what we want to see in the future for women and for people. And one of those was the abolish of sex trafficking, and they used the term, I believe, sex trafficking, which was very much a new thing. And that came a little bit out of a movement that was going along around the same time, which was anti-porn and anti-sex work. Now, anti-human trafficking is not, there are people in anti-trafficking that are anti-sex work, and there are people that are just anti-forced sex work. So that's not the same thing, but there was a large movement around that time that contributed to that being part of the conversation. So that's where you start to get sex trafficking becoming the knowledge of sex trafficking, people realizing that this is happening. We also started with the fall of the wall and everything going on in Eastern Europe, we started to see all sorts of types of exploitation in the movement of people and very impoverished people in between Eastern and Western Europe as well. And so this brings us to the mid-90s. Around the same time in the United States, we had a labor movement. And the labor movement, more or less, specifically there were a bunch of cases going on in Florida about forced labor. And actually it was the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is part of, I believe, the Food Chains Network. So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers was an advocacy group in Florida, started in the mid-90s, and they started bringing cases to the DOJ, and the federal prosecutors started prosecuting those cases. And the first case they prosecuted was US v. Flores, when there were 400 workers, undocumented, who were kept in trailers with armed guards and forced to work. And this was the first time that something within our justice system, we saw something that we looked at it and we were like, that is slavery. That's just plain out and simple slavery. It's not them getting paid too little. It's whatever else. It's not wage theft. The wage theft obviously is horrible. This is slavery. So we started to see more cases like that. And so it all culminated in the protocol. 2 protocols passed within a month of each other. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the federal legislation here in the States, and the UN protocol, which was tagged onto the end of a convention on crime. So that's the history. That's how we got to where we were. That's why no one talked about trafficking until the 1990s, more or less till the 2000s. So what's the definition of trafficking in the United States of America? This is the definition that comes directly from the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act. And as you can see, it's got both of those strands, right? It's got labor and sex. So the first one is sex. Sex trafficking, which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. I don't need to read all of them, but, and the second one is labor. And you can see down here more terms that we traditionally associate with slavery: voluntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, and slavery. So if you want to summarize that definition very succinctly, human trafficking is compelling someone to work or to engage in a commercial sex act. I'm going to real quickly run through these myths. They're definitely still extremely common. Sometimes I talk to people and I realize that maybe some of them are less common, but we still hear them all the time. So you may not think some of these things, but a lot of people do. Slavery is a part of history, not happening today. Not true. Human trafficking only happens in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. This is one of our favorites because it's not. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in the United States. I mean, you heard for about LGBT homeless youth, and you've heard about labor exploitation. Well, there's also more extreme cases. There's slavery. I mean, I'll share with you later the number of prosecutions in the state of Ohio in 2014, but I believe it was somewhere, there were 17 actual prosecutions and I think over 100 investigations. And that's that's when we've only had a law on the books against human trafficking in Ohio since I think 2012. So it's still a very new thing for prosecutors to look at this issue. But it's happening here. we know of a case in Blue Ash where an Indian couple was forced to work for years, and then there's also lots of cases of compelling people to sell sex. Foreigners must be involved. Human trafficking is not a crime that involves movement, it's not a crime that involves borders, and it's not a crime that involves foreigners. It is just compelling someone to work or compelling someone to engage in a commercial sex act. Individuals don't have to move across borders. This one I find to be most common now among politicians. You'll hear people talk about human trafficking, and then later in the conversation you realize that what they're talking about is child sex trafficking. And you'll also hear them throw out a whole bunch of numbers, quite honestly none of which are really substantiated. That is not true. In fact, most human trafficking is forced labor around the world. If we're talking in terms of a global perspective, most human trafficking is forced labor. A significant amount is sex as well. But even that, it's impossible to tell really how many people, how many minors you have. I mean, in Thailand and Cambodia, for example, child sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children was very common for a while, but there's been some really great work there, and now they rarely ever see cases of commercial sexual exploitation of children, although they will say things like forced begging. Number 7, victims self-identify. Victims usually do not self-identify. Especially if it's a forced labor case, people don't like to admit that someone had enough of a hold over them to force them to do something. And there's all sorts of types of vulnerabilities that allow, that put someone in a situation where they can be exploited. One of them is being an undocumented migrant, which is a huge problem we have here in the States, because if you are an undocumented migrant, then there's a natural fear of police for a good reason. And even if you are a documented migrant, which we find a lot in farm work, for example, with the H-2A visa, if someone enters the country on an H-2A visa, they're not allowed to switch employers. So, and if they do, they are in danger of losing their visa. So, again, even if they're documented, that document can be used, held over them in many different ways. So, all that to say that male victims don't self-identify because oftentimes they feel that it's shameful. And female victims also don't self-identify because we have all sorts of ways of justifying what has happened to us. More often than not, the people who identify situations of human trafficking are from the outside looking in, not from the inside looking out. Human smuggling is human trafficking, so I'm sure you've heard a lot about Syria, and today actually the European Union launched their Operation Sophia, which is where they're going into the Gulf right above Libya and turning smugglers back. And that's a whole issue unto itself, absolutely. But human smuggling is not, by virtue of human smuggling, human trafficking. Human smuggling is an issue, but there's things that set it apart from human trafficking. And we have to keep that in mind, because if we lose that, we lose some of the category.
Can you take questions or no?
Yeah, oh, sure.
Human smuggling.
Yes.
Does that mean against your will? Or
No.
what?
No, so
Migrants are being smuggled.
Yes.
Okay.
They're paying to be smuggled. So there's hundreds of thousands of, today in the world today we have more refugees, more externally displaced people, that's to say people displaced outside of their country of origin, than any time, at least since including World War II, more than there were in World War II. That does not count the millions and millions of people who are also internally displaced. Human smuggling involves people who are attempting to get to somewhere that they can't enter legally for a variety of reasons. And so they will pay a smuggler to then take them into the country.
Right.
And the situation we have in the Mediterranean is that they'll pay to get on these tiny little boats, and the boats are capsizing and people are drowning, and there's an incredible amount of exploitation going on with human smuggling, but human trafficking is different in that, in one way it's similar, and that is that sometimes people get into human trafficking because they are taking a job in a foreign country, or they do want to go work someplace, so they answer an advertisement or whatever else. But what's different about it is that human trafficking, the real crime happens when they arrive and are forced to work or engage in a commercial sex act. That is human trafficking. Can human smuggling result in human trafficking? Absolutely, but they're different. We just get a lot of people who equate the two when very different approaches are needed. And then victims are only victims if they were forced from the start, which actually plays right into what I just said. This is also not true. There's a lot of reasons people get into situations of human trafficking, but sometimes they get into the situation willingly. And let me explain that. There are lots and lots and lots of people who work overseas. The Philippines has 10 million overseas Filipino workers. Indonesia has probably about the same amount, maybe a little bit more, at least 10. I think it's closer to 14 million people that work overseas legally, documented workers that work overseas, and then many more who work overseas that are undocumented. Those people take jobs in a variety of situations: factories, domestic work. They take jobs on ships. They take textile industry, whatever, all sorts of different industries and different workplaces. But those people are vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And so some of those people will take a job and end up in a situation of human trafficking. The other place we see this is in forced prostitution. People tend to think of the story of the Hollywood film Taken as like the quintessential sex trafficking story, but it's really not. People aren't kidnapped off the streets and forced into prostitution. There's a variety of stories that we hear about how people end up in forced prostitution. One of the most common is a young girl, fake boyfriend who pretends to love her, takes her away from her family, addicts her to drugs, forces her into prostitution, and that is also horrible. But then we also hear stories of people that got into prostitution or sex work willingly that in the end found that they couldn't walk away. That is still human trafficking. The moment they couldn't walk away from the situation, it became human trafficking because it became forced. Okay, so I'm almost done, and then Mariah's going to take over. I'm going to go through basically broad categories in terms of how we think about human trafficking. And these are not, they're coextensive. They're not, like they overlap. Because clearly, if someone's, child labor is forced labor, right? But thinking about it in different terms is helpful because of the different types that we see. So child labor, I'll give a couple examples around the world for each one. Child labor, when someone who is under the age of 18 is forced to work, so against their will. So one common story is the Restaveks in Haiti, which are usually lower class children who will be sold to middle or upper class families to work as domestic servants in the household. It's a cultural custom. It's not necessarily legal, but it happens consistently. Another one that's very common is Lake Volta in Ghana, which is a massive lake and a huge fishing region. So children are sold between the ages of like 6 and 12 and then work for a fisherman until they reach the age of 18. But also slavery, child labor, and in both of those situations, the children are literally sold as if they were slaves. But then you also have situations in places like India where it's debt bondage and they inherit the debt. They're born into it. So, then domestic servitude. This is a category unto itself because it's common and also horrible. Just a couple days ago, there was a news story in the Independent about embassy workers in Dublin, Ireland, who had kept, presumably, they were foreign embassy workers, and presumably the maids that they had kept were from their own country of origin, but they had kept them and they had forced them to work and had enslaved them and also sexually and physically abused them. Those 10 million Filipino workers that I mentioned, those 10 to 14 million Indonesian workers, a lot of them go into domestic service. There's a lot of people all around the world that still require domestic servants. I know we don't use them very much in the States, but they're still pretty common. And actually one place that they're very, very common right now is the Middle East. So there are huge populations of Filipinos and Indonesians that are headed to the Middle East, and the other part is North Asia. So Taiwan, Japan, Korea, China.
I'm Jim Helton, president of the TriState Freethinkers. Please come support us at www.tristatefreethinkers.com. With that, we do great things like feed the homeless. We also throw birthday parties for homeless kids and do science-based speakers every month. So join us at the TriStateFreethinkers.com.
Bonded labor is any type of debt bondage. So when we're talking about a common example of that is in India, with brick kilns, for example, and also in the carpet industry and a couple other industries. People will borrow money and then they'll have to pay back that money. They'll have to work off the debt. Oftentimes the debt is either unpayable or they have to live on compound and they're charged a certain amount for living on the compound. There's a variety of schemes. And bonded labor also isn't isolated to India either. It's a common enslavement scheme. There was a group of Filipino maids in Florida, for example, in the 1990s, possibly the 2000s, that had all borrowed a bunch of money from recruiters in the Philippines and owed them thousands of dollars, and came to the States and were put in slave-like conditions, but were basically unable to do anything about it because their documents were held and they owed lots of money. And that, in a sense, is debt bondage as well. Forced labor is a general catch-all category for everything that we're talking about in terms of labor, and then sex trafficking, where we have forced prostitution and forcing someone to engage in a commercial sex act. That also, with sex trafficking, forcing someone to engage in a commercial sex act is key to sex trafficking, but sexual abuse is not isolated to sex trafficking. It's very, very common in many other places. If you could guess one, you'd be right, it's domestic servitude. But it's also common in many situations where women are in forced labor. Forms of modern abolition. These are all the things that people are doing to fight against it. Just general categories. Awareness building, primarily what we do. We do a little bit of policy making as well. Prosecution, victim aftercare, and survivor empowerment. So you build awareness about the problem. When you find a situation of human trafficking, you've got to prosecute it. Once you have victims, you need to help them recover, which involves a whole lot of aftercare, which can be psychological care, it can be job skills training, it can be a variety of things. You need good policy, which is something that we're still working through. We're only 15 years in, and really it's only been on the agenda of legislators for the past 5 to 10. And then at the end of it all, you also need a way to empower survivors. Oftentimes, especially when we're talking about global slavery, survivors come from very poor conditions. So they need jobs. They need a way to provide for their family. What was the vulnerability that put them in the situation to begin with that left them vulnerable to exploitation? Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, it was poverty or other societal factors. So how do you address those factors? Because if you take a victim out of forced labor and set them back in their country of origin, but you don't provide any alternative, the next time a shady advertisement comes up, they're probably still going to answer it because they need a job. They got to provide for themselves and for their family some way. We actually visited a survivor in Lithuania who had that exact problem. She was trafficked as a teenager, returned to Lithuania, and she did receive a small chunk of money for testifying against the gang that trafficked her to the United Kingdom from Lithuania. But she has 4 children, a deadbeat boyfriend, no job skills. She was trafficked when she was 16, so she has no resume. She doesn't know how to do anything. And she's living in a crappy apartment where it was filled with black mold. And so her problem is poverty. She needs empowerment, just like many survivors out there. She needs a way to provide for herself and for her family. Okay, slavery today. 20.9 million enslaved today. That's the International Labor Organization. I will tell you that that number is the best. I do not stand by it necessarily. It's incredibly hard to map any crime. It's also incredibly hard to get good estimates on any global problem. To give you just an example, in terms of the difficulty of providing good numbers for a global problem, in 2007, AIDS was discovered in the early 1980s. In 2007, 27 years into the AIDS movement, UNAIDS came out and said, well, our statistical data was off, the projections we had were wrong, the data we were using from antenatal clinics, which doesn't know the thing, it was bad, and the estimate of people with AIDS in the world dropped from 42 million to 30 million people. So that's something that's relatively mappable, something that's relatively easy in the sense that you can go to hospitals, right? This is different. This is hidden, and so it's incredibly hard. I mean, beyond just prosecution data and hearsay data and whatever else you can get, it's incredibly hard to get good data. I will say it's been documented in every country in the world, and if I had to give an estimate, it would be between 15 and 20 million. So I think this is probably the best that we have. But you're also welcome to look into the numbers more. I have read through the International Labor Organization's methodology, and it is the best out there, but there's just a lot of guesswork. Good estimates in terms of the way in which the different types of trafficking, different demographics are pretty good because they're usually based off of various data. I think the one that I'd like to point to is female versus male. You can see females are enslaved a little bit higher, but generally speaking, it's actually fairly equal. The numbers, question mark, goes back to what I was saying. Here's some general numbers and estimates that are out there. So the Department of Homeland Services opened 987 investigations. FBI was 835. DOJ did 208. These are both estimates. Department of Homeland and Department of Health and Human Services opened 1,264. So in terms of like a global problem, we've probably had, I don't know, maybe about 10,000 a year that we could realize. Well, yeah. Anyway, back to human trafficking in Ohio. 85 human trafficking investigations, 98 arrests, and 17 successful criminal convictions. What does human trafficking look like in Ohio? It does look like there is some international trafficking into Ohio, and that oftentimes goes back to migrants and immigrants, undocumented migrants as well as just general immigrants. So Ohio industries employing migrant labor, textiles, agriculture, restaurants, construction, domestic work, and then brothels that have been found in Ohio fronting as legitimate businesses, all of these. So domestic trafficking in Ohio, vulnerability factors, and a couple cases from 2014. So vulnerability factors, the first one at the top of the list, you just heard about 45 minutes ago. LGBT youth, and specifically LGBT homeless youth. Runaways, homeless youth, history of violence, sexual abuse, poverty. So here are a couple examples of cases that happened in Ohio, where the first one, drugs, alcohol, and physical violence controlled the victim. The second one, a woman was advertising herself online and working for her pimp in exchange for heroin. And the third is another heroin dealer who was prostituting women. So all three of these were successful convictions for human trafficking in the state of Ohio in 2014. So that's my piece. I hope that gave you a decent overview of what human trafficking is, what it looks like around the world.
Yes, I understand that my whole life is just a blink of an eye. The history of the earth is with each moment that goes by. But this moment that I'm with you, it feels like time has stood still. It feels somehow like it matters, and that it always will. Thank you so much.